So here we are, 1848. Promised to speak about this crucial year. Many people who study history don't like dates. I'm trying to keep away from dates so that one is not overwhelmed by them. But there are a few dates in life and in history that need to be remembered. We did speak about the long 19th century, which we are still in. A long 19th century, which begins in the, roughly in our discussion, from the 1770s until 1914. And more or less in the middle of that is the year 1848. Why 1848? Well, that is because it is a major landmark in modern European history. In that year, revolutions broke out throughout much of the European continent, from Ireland to Italy to Spain, virtually in all parts, in one form or another, in the European continent, with the exception of the Russian Empire, the Russian portion of the empire in Europe. And these revolutions were particularly important as a catalyst for political and socioeconomic change in Central Europe. And Central Europe is the world in which we are operating in this course. The Austrian Empire, which I introduced to you last time, was deeply shaken by the upheavals connected with 1848, so much so that it seemed at certain times that the empire would not even survive as a state. And what was this empire that by the end of the 18th century, the 1770s, had come to rule over the entire area of Carpathian Rus, both north and south of the mountains? Well, just to reiterate very briefly that which I spoke about last time, three factors. First of all, this empire was multinational, multilingual. It included a whole host of nationalities, a whole host of languages that I elaborated upon last time. The second factor is that it was administratively divided, if you will, into two halves. The Austrian half, and if we look at this map, it is clearer because of the color differentiation. So if the entire blue is the Austrian Empire, the light blue is the Austrian half, and the darker blue is the Hungarian kingdom. So we have these two halves of the empire. Another characteristic to reiterate is that the empire was ruled throughout our period by the imperial family of Habsburgs. That's what it had been since the Middle Ages and is still throughout our entire long historic 19th century. And since we have two halves of the empire, well, each new Habsburg monarch not only had two titles, but had to be crowned twice. Not once, twice. First as Emperor of Austria, the Austrian half of the empire, and then as King of Hungary. It was these two coronations that provided legitimacy for Habsburg rule. So you had to be crowned first before you could rule. You're going to see why that's important. And so this period and for the rest of the empire's existence, each reigning monarch and its entire administration and governing apparatus carried a joint title. Imperial and royal. So everything was named imperial and royal. Or in the German world, if you're still in Austria today, you can see old signs that say K und K, K-U-K, which means Kaiserlich und Königlich, imperial and royal. So now that we have reviewed those three basic, very basic characteristics of the Habsburg Empire, what happened in 1848? And how did what happened in the empire as a whole have an impact on our subject, Carpatho-Rusyns? When in early 1848, a revolution broke out in the Austrian Empire, already, by the way, in March, 1 month after the revolutions in general began in Europe, and one might wonder, well, where did they actually begin? Because they were all over the continent. Well, you may realize or not suspect or surmise that they begin where a lot of revolutions begin, because these are the people who are protesting all the time, and they can very easily rip up those cobblestones on the street and build barricades, and that's in Paris. So the revolution actually began in Paris, as revolutions are wont to begin in the European continent. In February, already in the beginning of March, the quote-unquote copycats, took a little bit of time to get the information across, was now in Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire. Of course, we know that this Austrian Empire had all of these different peoples, nationalities, speakers of various languages living within it. And those peoples reacted in different ways. So, for instance, the Austrian Germans, mostly liberal-minded, urban-educated, professional classes in the imperial capital of Vienna, they called for an end to the police state. This was a conservative state in the first half of the chronological 19th century, headed by a chancellor named von Metternich. So they wanted to get rid of this police state with all of its controls, and they wanted to implement in turn, in replacement, civil rights, and civil rights that should be guaranteed by a constitution. So we want a written constitution, and also by political representation, how? Through an elected parliament. So here are all these new things. Civil rights, constitution, elected parliament. The Austro-German spokespersons also called for the emancipation of the peasants. Remember, we spoke about the peasants throughout the empire, and specifically in Carpathian Rus, proprietary peasants, all being owned for all intents and purposes by landlords. There were efforts to help them in the late 18th century, but they remained the property of landlords. And so they called for the emancipation of the peasants from serfdom. Now the Hungarians, that is the rulers of that other half of the empire, in the Hungarian kingdom, they had their own parliament, or diet actually, their own diet, which was controlled by nobles. But it was kind of inspired, already beginning in the 1840s, by the passionate rhetoric of a Hungarian noble member, very patriotic, one can say nationalist Hungarian leader, named Lajos Kossuth. Lajos Kossuth. He, as a representative of Hungarian, or we can say also Magyar, which is in some cases a synonym, he wanted to end direct imperial rule and to govern the kingdom, that the Hungarians should govern the kingdom by themselves. That is, it's their diet that should make the decisions of how to run the kingdom and not the empire and the imperial regime in Vienna. So it was always this kind of playing off between these two centers. This didn't mean that they wanted to get rid of the Habsburgs. No, we keep the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs still are our kings, but they are nominal. The real power should be in the hands of the Hungarians themselves through their diet or perhaps a parliament, not in Vienna, but in Budapest. And then we have the various Slavic peoples and Romanians living in the Habsburg realm. Each of them was under the impact of nationalist ideology. We spoke about nationalism at the beginning of this course. And each of them hoped to achieve full cultural and a degree of political autonomy, self-rule, autonomy, self-rule, not independence, but at least self-rule, whether political or the very minimum cultural, and would like to see, therefore, the empire restructured and not just have these two halves. Perhaps somewhat might say surprisingly, the Habsburg authorities reacted to these revolutionary activity, revolutionary ideas, and reacted quite quickly. Extraordinary for the Habsburgs. And in a sense, they adopted their own revolutionary agenda. In April already, the following month after the revolution began on the streets of Vienna, the Habsburgs permitted the convocation of a constitutional assembly. That is, fine, okay, representative government, let's have a parliament. At least for the Austrian half, the light blue, of the empire. And then the following month, in May, they issued an imperial decree which abolished serfdom. This is kind of getting ahead, quick. Now, also at the same time, in Hungary, the Hungarian leaders also in the Diet enacted a whole series of laws that came to be known as the so-called March Constitution, because this was done already in March, and among which those laws were ones that abolished serfdom as well, ended the church tithe, that everyone didn't have to pay 10% of their income to the church, and most importantly, and most shockingly, by a diet run by nobles, but because of the liberal attitudes of Lajos Kossuth, it ended the situation in which nobles did not have to pay taxes. So now nobles have to pay taxes. For all intents and purposes, these decrees, in effect, ended the era of feudalism and also changed the status of the vast majority of the inhabitants of the empire, most of whom were proprietary serfs, and that included Carpatho-Rusyns. Now all of whom, these proprietary serfs, became free peasant farmers. Now this revolutionary fever in the spring of 1848 prompted the various nationalities living within the empire to make their own demands for some sort of autonomy or self-rule. But their differing and often conflicting demands, because if one group wanted one thing and they're living on the same territory as somebody else, they may clash. So sometimes there was clashes here. But aside from the demands of all of these stateless nationalities, they were overshadowed by the events that unfolded in the Hungarian kingdom, in the Hungarian half of the empire. Hungary's diet was abolished and replaced by a parliament, and a parliament not made up only of nobles. So now we have a Hungarian parliament instead of a Hungarian diet. And that parliament refused to provide troops to the imperial forces. Why? Why did the imperial forces need troops? Because there was revolution in other parts of the empire, and in particular in the northern Italian lands that still at this time belonged to the empire. Lombardy, Venetia, Tuscany. This is a map of 1910. But all of these lands here in what is now northern Italy were still part of the Habsburg realm, and the Italians were rebelling against Habsburg rule, and so the imperial army needed troops to be sent down there to suppress that revolution. They called on the Hungarians. After all, it's part of the empire, and the Hungarians said, no, we're not going down there to fight against, for the Habsburgs. And instead, at the urging of this fiery leader Kossuth, the Hungarian parliament in the summer of 1848 authorized the formation of its own army. So they're arguing, we don't need to be part of the imperial army. We're going to have our own army, or Hungarian National Guard, or something called the Honveds. So now the Hungarians have their own army. And as all of that's going on, within the Hungarian kingdom, among the various nationalities living there, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Slovaks, each of them is calling also for autonomy and even for formation of their own military units in order to defend their interests. Now, it's interesting that initially the Habsburg imperial government in Vienna supported the demands of these various nationalities, non-Magyars, in Hungary. Why? Because they were trying to neutralize the Hungarians, the Magyars. Kossuth at the same time also, and the Hungarian parliament, however, were adamant that the territorial unity of the kingdom must in no way be jeopardized. And so now we have the Hungarians first clashing with the various nationalities living within their kingdom. In fact, by September, full-scale battles broke out between, for instance, the Hungarian National Guard and the Croats, because all of present-day Croatia was part of the Hungarian kingdom, in turn part of the Habsburg Empire. So now things are getting very complicated. And in the midst of these events, and as war was now raging between the Hungarians and the imperial army, because the imperial army is now coming to Hungary to try to put the Hungarians down, at the end of the year, the emperor, the Habsburg Empire, a man named Ferdinand, he resigns in December. And he is replaced by a young 18-year-old Habsburg Archduke named Franz, who then, when he's coronated, adopts the other name Joseph, harking back to the revolutionary Joseph II at the end of the 19th century, And so in 1848, 18-year-old ruler now of the entire Habsburg realm. Well, remember what I said at the beginning of this course, of this lecture, when we were talking about the two halves of the empire and the general characteristics, and that each new monarch had to be crowned Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, right? Well, now we have a new monarch, Franz Joseph, and this now turned out to be a very convenient excuse for the Hungarians. Why? Because they proclaimed that they were not legally bound to the new emperor because he was not crowned as tradition demanded in Hungary. Well, he couldn't be crowned in Hungary because there was a war going on between the Habsburgs and the Hungarians. Oh, he can't travel there. Too bad. He's not our king. As this war between the Hungarian forces and the Imperial Austrian army continues, the Hungarians initially held their ground, but then they're pushed farther and farther eastward. So if we look at this map, here is Vienna, here is Budapest. The war is going on here. The Hungarians are pushed farther and farther eastward until by April they are in a town called Debrecen, which is in the present-day country of Hungary. But in Debrecen in 1849, in April 1849, the Hungarian leaders proclaim Hungary an independent kingdom. So now it goes that far. Unable clearly to suppress what was now a full-scale war to preserve Hungary's independence, couldn't put them down. So what does the young 18-year-old Franz Joseph do? He accepts an offer of military assistance from Austria's ally, the Russian Empire. And he travels from Vienna northward, crosses the border into what is now Poland, and actually to Warsaw. That was part of the Russian Empire. And as the 18-year-old emperor, he nonetheless gets down on his knees. He kisses the hand of Tsar Nicholas I and asks him for assistance. Pretty remarkable, because princes shouldn't do it, and certainly kings, but not emperors. But he did. But he got his troops. As a result, Tsar Nicholas I promptly sends Russian troops to cross the border into the Austrian province of Galicia. So here is Warsaw, the troops are here, they cross into the Austrian Empire, into Galicia. From there, they then continue across the Carpathians into the Hungarian kingdom, and at a place called Világos, which is in Transylvania, part of the Hungarian kingdom, today part of Romania. There, the Russian army defeats the Hungarians, who are forced to surrender. And so it's thanks to the Russian Tsar and also to Hungary's Slavic and Romanian peoples who remained loyal to the Austrian emperor that the Austrian Empire was saved and able to remain territorially intact. So this is the story, for all intents and purposes, from the beginning of the revolution in March 1848 until August 1849 and the defeat of the Hungarians. Well, what impact did these revolutionary events, the Revolution of 1848 have on Carpatho-Rusyns. And in particular, those living south of the Carpathians, the majority of them, in the Hungarian kingdom. Perhaps not unexpectedly, as in most societies, the vast majority of at least the peasant population remained totally oblivious to the political and military events happening all around them, but over which they had little real knowledge, and over which, even if they had some knowledge, they certainly had no control. There was, of course, a small percentage of Carpatho-Rusyns who did take an interest in what was going on in civic affairs. Most of them were priests and seminarians in the Greek Catholic Church, of the Greek Catholic Church. And we know all about the Greek Catholic Church as the symbol of Carpatho-Rusyn identity and culture at this time. And for the most part, the Greek Catholic hierarchs, priests, and seminarians greeted favorably and even enthusiastically the political demands of the Hungarian revolutionaries. In fact, as early as March 1848, many of the students at the seminary in Uzhhorod, which you know where it is, or you will know where it is, or you're going to prove that you know where it is after I hand out this map, they even rushed to join this newly formed Hungarian National Army, National Guard. And symbolically, a Greek Catholic priest, also a member of the highest hierarchy in the eparchy, not of Uzhhorod, but of Prešov. His name was Victor Dobryansky. Note similar to that name on the top, but Victor. He summed up what he described as the traditional Carpatho-Rusyn loyalty to Hungary when he said, quote, "Hungarian freedom is dearer than Russian autocracy. And the pleasant atmosphere of Hungary," which is, by the way, quite warm and sunny. He didn't say that, but I'm saying that. "The pleasant atmosphere of Hungary is more attractive than the winters of Siberia." Why the reference to Siberia, Russia, Russian Tsar, we'll see in a moment. But as it turned out, loyalty to Hungary was to be overshadowed, at least initially, by the activity of this Victor Dobryansky, whom I've just cited, overshadowed by the activity of his brother, whose name was Adolf Dobryansky. Adolf Dobryansky, mining engineer living at the time in a district in what is today Central Slovakia. In 1848, when that Hungarian parliament was established to replace the old Diet, he was elected to the Hungarian parliament. And before the end of the year, he moves eastward to Prešov, the other center of Carpatho-Rusyn life. Those two cities, Prešov in present-day Slovakia and Uzhhorod in present-day Ukraine. These are the two cultural, civic, political, and eventually we're going to see political centers for Carpatho-Rusyns. So he goes to Prešov, and there, together with local civic activists, he formulates a political program. This is the first political program for Carpatho-Rusyns, which he then presents in person to the young Emperor Franz Joseph in January 1849. You could get access to emperors in those days, even if you were a peasant, if you had did it at the right time. Or there were very often public audiences that were held. But he was more than a peasant, so he's a member of parliament. He gets an audience with the emperor. And in this political manifesto program that he submits, he calls for to restructure the Austrian half of the empire, or for all intents and purposes, to restructure the whole Austrian empire, in order that there be a distinct Rusin crown land that would unite the Carpatho-Rusyns living in Hungary with the Rusyns or Ruthenians living north of the mountains throughout the provinces of Galicia and Bukovina. So that calling for a crown land that would include all of northeastern Hungary and the two eastern provinces of the Austrian half of the empire. But the imperial authorities were not too enthusiastic about this idea, that is, creating a single administrative unit that would cross the borders of Austrian-ruled Galicia and historic Hungary. They have enough problem with the Hungarians to begin with. However, they did see at this time, in the beginning of 1849, in this Dobryansky, a political ally. And so, in April 1849, the same month in which Kossuth is proclaiming an independent Hungary, this Dobryansky Adolf is appointed civil commissar. What does that mean? He became Imperial Austria's liaison with that advancing Tsarist army that Nicholas II was sending southward into Galicia and into Hungary. To do what? To struggle against the Hungarian revolutionaries. And so what do we want to take away from this? That, I think, somewhat silly phrase. What is the takeaway? Well, the takeaway is the most prominent Carpatho-Rusyn activist at the time, this Adolf Dobryansky, was enlisted by the very forces which were to crush Hungary's efforts at creating an independent state. And this anti-Hungarian position of Adolf Dobryansky was, as we're going to see, to have negative consequences for him personally, as well as for the entire Carpatho-Rusyn movement. But as long as the Habsburg authorities were in control of the situation, and with the help of the Russian Empire, they just defeated the Hungarians. So as long as they were in control of the situation, Dobryansky and Carpatho-Rusyn national and cultural interests were protected. After Austria's imperial armies defeated the Hungarian revolutionaries, obviously with the major help of the Russian forces, that is in August 1849, Dobryansky again returns to Vienna. This is in October, just a couple months after the defeat of the Hungarians. He comes back with a second petition, a second political petition, which he delivers to the Emperor Franz Joseph. But in this second one, there was no mention, no reference to the Ruthenians or the Rusyns living on the northern slopes of the Carpathians in Austrian-ruled Galicia and Bukovina. Instead, this new petition calls for the recognition of the Carpatho-Rusyn nationality in Hungary, specifically, and for the establishment of a distinct Rusin territorial entity where officials would be of Carpatho-Rusyn nationality and where the Rusin language would be taught in schools and used in the local administration. So this is second petition, October 1849. That very same month, the Austrian imperial government, which now, after the defeat of the Hungarians, rules the Hungarian kingdom directly, completely against what Kossuth was fighting for. So he lost. Now the Austrians controlled the Hungarian kingdom, placed the entire kingdom under military law, divided into military and civil districts, controlled directly by the imperial authorities in Vienna. One of the civil districts was based in that city of Uzhhorod, one of those two civic and cultural centers for Carpatho-Rusyns. And it included those eastern counties just east of Uzhhorod that were primarily inhabited by Carpatho-Rusyns, Ung, Bereg, Ugocha, Maramaros. And as an advisor and deputy to the district head, Dobryansky effectively administered this Uzhhorod district, which he viewed as the basis for a future, specifically national Carpatho-Rusyn administrative entity. In fact, many of the local officials in this Uzhhorod district were drawn from the Carpatho-Rusyn inhabitants. Rusyn was introduced as a subject in secondary schools, and in public signs were posted in Rusyn alongside Hungarian and German. Also, Carpatho-Rusyns living to those districts or those counties just to the east of Uzhhorod, or just to the west of Uzhhorod, around Prešov in eastern Slovakia, that is counties like Zemplin, Šariš, and Spiš, they too demanded that their people and their region be united with this Uzhhorod district. This desire that all Carpatho-Rusyn inhabited land south of the mountains in the Hungarian kingdom be united in one administrative unit was to be reiterated on numerous occasions in the second half of our 19th century, and certainly, as we're going to see, in the 20th century. Now, this Uzhhorod district was actually to last only a few months, from October 1849 until March 1850. So we're talking about 5.5, 6 months. So it lasted only a short period of time, but the desire for some kind of autonomy, some kind of self-rule, that desire was to remain part of the Carpatho-Rusyn political agenda for the next century and a half. I might add, until the present. More immediately, however, were Carpatho-Rusyn cultural achievements. We've been talking about civic and political activity. Well, what was going on in the cultural realm as a result of these events of the Revolution of 1848? These, that is, cultural events were associated for the most part with another figure, and that other figure was the second one here. He, however, unlike Dobryansky, was a Greek Catholic priest, and his name was Alexander Dukhnovych. Alexander Dukhnovych. Same time, but in the cultural world. This Dukhnovych, who was from Prešov, that Western cultural center for Carpatho-Rusyns, established there in 1850 the first Carpatho-Rusyn cultural organization. It was called the Prešov Literary Society. It functioned for 4 years. During that time, it sponsored 12 publications, including a play in Carpatho-Rusyn, the first play in Carpatho-Rusyn literature. Published several literary almanacs, 1850, 51, 52, and it was in one of those almanacs that a poem by Dukhnovych called Vruchania, or Dedication, appeared, and this work was to become the basis for a national hymn. But, you know, the role of literature is important in galvanizing national patriotism. So one should always study literature. And in this poem that opens up with the famous phrase, Ya Rusin byl, jesam I budu, which means I was, am, and will remain a Rusin. It's the national credo to this day. And even after this Prešov Literary Society ceased to exist in 1853, Dukhnovych continued to write several histories of Carpatho-Rusyns. an influential pedagogical guide for teachers, numerous religious texts, which were reprinted over and over and over again. This sudden increase in publishing activity brought to the fore a problem, which proved to be a challenge, that of a standard literary language. Now, we spoke about language as a phenomenon unto itself in one of our opening lectures. We know and should know that there's a difference between spoken language and written language, or literary languages. Literary languages are all created. They're all artificial, including the English that I'm struggling with as we speak, or as I speak. Ever since the debates about the relationship of Carpatho-Rusyns to other East Slavs, which were debates that took place in the beginning of our long 19th century, as I mentioned last time, 1820s, 1830s, this Dukhnovych was inclined to associate his Carpatho-Rusyn people with Russia. For instance, he recalled in his memoirs how, and I quote him, "One thing really gave me joy in life, and that was in 1849 when I first saw the glorious Russian army on the streets of Prešov," that Russian army that was on its way to crush the Hungarian revolutionaries. Dukhnovych and the political activist at the same time, Dobryansky, were both what we call Russophiles. I'm going to get into this a little bit more in our next lecture. But suffice it to say now, what is being a Russophile? And what do we mean here? It's not just someone who likes Russian culture. In the case of, in the context of Carpatho-Rusyns, it is someone who believes that he or she and all Carpatho-Rusyns are a branch of the Russian nationality, and that the Russian Empire and its Tsar are the best guarantor of the Eastern Rite Christian faith, and the Tsar as ultimately the only force that could save them from the danger of national assimilation with the Hungarians or the Magyars. And with these kind of convictions, it is not surprising that Dukhnovych, Dobryansky, and their followers believed that Russian was the most appropriate literary language for Carpatho-Rusyns. And so the first newspapers published in Vienna in the 1850s and 1860s, all at the expense of the Austrian government, but intended for the Rusyns and Ruthenians, not only of Hungary, but also of Austrian Galicia and Bukovina, were all in Russian. But in the end, all the rhetoric about affinities with Russian culture and with Russian language did nothing to change the reality of living in a state, in this case the Hungarian kingdom, in which Hungarian was the official and dominant language for civic affairs and for education. In fact, Dukhnovych complained continually about the almost uncontrollable urge of educated Carpatho-Rusyns to Magyarize themselves. Again, we're talking about the intelligentsia here, not the people. One might say that the people are rising, whereas the intelligentsia is staying at the bottom, or just the opposite, depending on how you want to understand what I'm about to say here. To Magyarize themselves, to become Hungarians. And in an attempt to reverse this trend, two new national societies are established, in which Dukhnovych and Dobryansky were the founders, St. John the Baptist Society in Prešov, St. Basil the Great Society in Uzhhorod. The primary goal of both of these societies was to assist students and seminarians who come to the big city, quote unquote, assist them through publications of Rusin, or more properly, Russian language textbooks, and through providing financial support for student dormitories in those two same cities. And so now to sum up what we've been just saying. This revolution of 1848, subsequently remembered by historians as the spring of nations, or the spring of nationalities, actually, the rebirth. This actually is an epithet that is well deserved, and certainly with regard to the many peoples of the Habsburg Empire, the many stateless peoples of the Habsburg Empire. And in the case of one of them, Carpatho-Rusyns in particular, those living in the Hungarian kingdom, they experienced what in retrospect was their first national awakening. Their first national awakening. The revolutionary events of 1848-49, as we've seen, provided an opportunity for an energetic civic activist out of Dobryansky and cultural activist Alexander Dukhnovych, for Dobryansky, the civic activist, to formulate publicly for the first time the very idea of a distinct Carpatho-Rusyn nationality that's deserving of a specific territorial entity. And even if political achievements were limited to a few months of tenuous autonomy, that Uzhhorod district, they nonetheless made an impression and remained in the collective consciousness of educated Carpatho-Rusyn society. And perhaps even more important were the cultural achievements inspired by this Alexander Dukhnovych, which we saw, as I just mentioned, to create in the 1860s the foundation of the first cultural organizations and the first newspaper specifically for Carpatho-Rusyns published in their homeland. And yet, in another sense, the long-standing fears of this Alexander Dukhnovych, fears that already existed before the revolution of 1848, were still there. And why? Well, that's because the national awakening that was beginning in 1848 had no depth. Unlike other nationalities, Carpatho-Rusyns were thrust into this post-1848 political arena completely unprepared. They had not yet established a clear sense of who they were, their own identity. They were only beginning to form rudimentary organized cultural base. And so what subsequently came to be known, and as I've just referred to it, as the Carpatho-Rusyn National Awakening, or the first Carpatho-Rusyn National Awakening, remained the work of a few individuals who, in the short period of 20 years, 1848 until 1867, were not able to affect the masses of the population in any significant way. And so we might ask, did these leaders achieve the success that they did before 1848 and 1867? They did have some successes. Well, how was this possible? Well, the answer, in one sense, is simple. They entered public life at a time when their Hungarian rulers were completely subordinate to Vienna, And at a time when the Austrian imperial government, for its own purposes, felt it to be advantageous from time to time to give support, real or token encouragement, to Carpatho-Rusyns and to other peoples within their realm. And so we have this fortunate combination of events. But that fortunate combination of events was to change after 1867, a year that ushered in a new era in the history of the Austrian Empire. And it's to that post-1867 era that we will turn when we return after our break.